this year that we're talking about stories and the impact of stories and how our identity and values and behavior, how they're all interlinked to form a kind of story. And last time I spoke with you, you were in France. Are you still in France now?
Yes, yeah, still here.
Well, I suppose that our location is part of that story, isn't it? You know, like if you were based in England, you'd have a different story. Now that you're in France, you have a story that keeps you where you are. And if the story were to change, you know, you might feel that, you know, your behavior needs to change. And sometimes for us, it implies, oh, maybe we're not in the right place at the right time. And so being in the right place at the right time is a big aspect of our stories, isn't it?
Yes, I guess so. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I guess it is. I mean, you're right in that if we change our venue, I mean, because I see stories about conveying important aspects like socialization and culture. So moving to a different country, you know, not everything, in fact, most things are not explicit. Nobody goes around telling you this is how you do things. We learn those things through stories. And we develop our own stories. So the number of people over the years who, you know, like yourself might have said, okay, what are you doing in France? How long have you been there? Then you create, I'm saying create, but you actually develop that as a story that you then gets recounted. And it's almost like it's our personal story to explain how we got to be where we are. And it's interesting that in doing that, of course, we can recreate parts of our history. And I see that quite a lot when people move countries. They have a chance almost to recreate a story, to have almost a new element in their story.
It's the story that you've brought with you because you grew up in one country and there was a whole story around that, and now you've settled in another country. And it's the same for me. I was born in Punjab and I live in England, and so there's the story within the story, and it's like, how do these stories interrelate? And very often I know that people of my generation, a lot of them are saying that when they first moved to England, when they, you know, with their families, they first migrated, they had it was almost as though they lived in two separate worlds. There was a world, like when they went to school, when I went to school, it was a different world which didn't really interrelate with the world that I was living in when I was back home with my family. Perhaps for you felt that maybe in the first few years that you were in France, or for maybe longer than that, did you feel that you were in separate worlds, or did you find it very easy to kind of integrate with the story that you had now become part of?
I think it is quite hard to integrate fully, particularly the older you get. I think, you know, and I think about my daughter who came here when she was 7. Then she integrated almost immediately. I mean, she's now living in a different culture again in Belgium, but she's she was very fully bilingual at an early age. She'd taken on a lot of the French cultural norms of teenagers that were a little bit different to maybe what our norms would have been. And she had integrated. I think it's harder as an adult to do that because you're carrying so much baggage. You know, we've all got all our stories behind us that we're bringing with us. But I hit it when I've gone back to the UK. Then I can see the difference. And it's sometimes in little things, you know, like the stories people are talking about on the street and the things people are watching on the television, the way our lives get shaped by the media is different from one country to another. So yeah, I think it's fascinating that it's interesting that you've got that sort of background as well.
Yeah, and also the language that we use to tell our stories, you know, the language that we use to think, that shapes our identity and it shapes our behavior in turn, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, yeah.
I taught English for a long time, and when I was teaching English, I remember it might have been Spain or it might have been Italy, I'm not sure, but I always used to say to my students to think in English. Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
As though it's that simple to just, switch to thinking in English. And but if I think that's like, tell me, how you, I mean, did you learn French as an adult, or did you learn French as a child? Because I think that the age that we learn the other language, like your daughter, she learned it when she was 7. I learned English when I was about 6 or 7 as well. And I think learning a language as a child, I think we find it easier to switch to the other way of thinking, as it were. Rather, like if I were to learn Chinese or Mandarin or Cantonese, being an adult, I think I would find it very difficult to shift into the other perspective.
Yes, yeah. No, I think just to answer that question, I learned it. I did learn French at school, but it was much more grammatical. It wasn't a sort of, even though I spent 3 weeks in France when I was 16 on an exchange, living with a family. I then went back and then just got lost and absorbed back into the English culture to such an extent that, going on holiday to France in my 20s and 30s didn't really keep that language up. So it wasn't till I came over here in my 40s that I started to really realize the difference between knowing a little bit of language and having to interact on a daily basis in your daily life with a different language. So it is more difficult the older you get.
And there is research to show that those who are bilingual tend to be more creative, so and I suppose that could be related to the fact that we shift we find it, we're quite skilled or practiced in shifting our perspective. And like in the creativity world, there are we often hear of workshops in creative thinking and like books on creative thinking, and I always feel that thinking is only one part of creativity in any case. But those who speak numerous languages, I know like a lot of people brought up in India will speak at least 3 languages. They'll speak English, they'll speak Hindi, and they will speak the language of their own state. And in Africa, likewise, people will speak at least 3 or 4 different languages. And whereas in England, I think that there isn't as much importance given to not only know another language, but to know another language well enough to be able to really converse fluently in it. And I've heard stories of like people going to France and insisting on speaking in English. And I know the French don't like that, do they? They don't like people coming over and kind of like as though their kind of language is because it is the dominant language nowadays. It's like that doesn't give us the right to not appreciate the other point of view.
That's really interesting, because things are shifting here as well. I think the French people are understanding more and more the importance of knowing English as well. I have difficulty, even after 27 years now, because I still have an English accent when I speak French. So often people come back to me and start speaking in start speaking in English when they pick up that accent. And I really have to, I have to stop them without insulting them, because sometimes they would feel hurt if I said, no, please don't, speak to me in French. And they want to try out their English. So I think that's fascinating, the way that is shifting as well. And people are much more flexible here as well about speaking. But yes, the worst thing to do is to come over and say, do you speak English? And in a very loud voice, and expect everyone to do that. I think it's having that cultural sensitivity that's really important, whether it's language or whether it's just understanding the norms as well, because it's more than just language.
That's right. And I think I haven't sort of explored this fully, but those who teach creative thinking, I think I'm going to ask them how many different languages they speak, because that also would enrich their experience, wouldn't it? Rather than just thinking about divergent thinking in one language. Well, how about, because I know, like, sometimes I struggle for words only because I'm bilingual and I'm thinking about a word that I want to use, but I know it's not in the right language, so I have to think harder about it. But then that also shows the versatility as well, I suppose. That I can see clearly that there isn't just one way of looking at something.
Could I just come in there? Because I've taught creative thinking for a long time. And I didn't start, in fact, so it's interesting that I didn't start, in fact, till I came over here. So that's one thing. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't have said that my understanding of French has helped, but it may have been that the flexibility and being able to adjust to another culture and being able to mix, to work between, it's not just another culture, because in working when I came over here in France, I was also working across Europe. So I was also bumping into other cultures. My first teaching roles were for the Open University on their MBA, where there was a module in creative thinking. And I was working with multicultural groups there. So it might have been German, Russian, a few Spanish, as well as maybe French, Italian. So what I did develop very quickly is actually a real liking for non-language based creative techniques. So using metaphor, because and drawing metaphor. So if you use images, if you use drawing, then you're getting over those blockages of the difficulty of finding the word to describe something. And to my mind, that opens up the thinking, it opens up the perspective far more. So images cross culture is much easier than, words do. So we can all look at a drawing or we could draw something and take something from that. And so that's been my take on it, really.
And I suppose that when we are using metaphors, every metaphor is subject to interpretation. That's what makes them so powerful, because we can draw conclusions from that metaphor based on our own reality, our own experience. And I suppose that the metaphors, the analogies, the images, as you say, all of these things, they're subject to interpretation. And when we can interpret those things from different points of view, not our own point of view, and language can be one of the ways. It's like, well, if I'm thinking, or if I want to describe this in English, I will do, I will focus on this. But if I'm looking at it from Punjabi point of view, I will focus on something totally different, perhaps, because the values are different.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I suppose there needs to be some sort of synthesis. Like when I said to you earlier about how when I was growing up, it was as though I lived in two separate worlds. There was the external world of the school, and then there was the home, the personal world. And a lot of people experience that kind of fragmentation, I suppose. And it's about creating that synthesis. It's like, how can we synthesize what we're experiencing from multiple perspectives to create this kind of tapestry? It's like, so it's not just our own small experience, our own little story, but how do we form part of that bigger story?
Absolutely.
Which so many different images.
No, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do when we're using imagery and using metaphor as a basis, really. That's why I like, using drawing, using imagery and visioning, or in story. One of my favorite techniques is to develop a storyboard to get to a vision. So you've got and if you can do it using images, then they're very powerful. Images are very powerful in storytelling.
And how does that shape people's behavior? How does it transform their behavior? How does the story transform behavior?
I think it has potential to reach people at emotional level. So I think that, when you're looking at behavior, in order to change behavior, you need to look at the different sort of components of it. There's always a logical, rational explanation for the behavior, and there's a belief underneath it, and there's also an emotional element around that belief. There's a sort of feeling attached to it. I think what images can do in stories, and stories can do, is reach that emotional level. It cuts below that logical, rational explanation. And that's what, I'm not a great fan of logical explanations in life. I think that's, by telling stories, you can kind of reach an emotional level. It's also the danger, of course, because we can be manipulated by that. So there's always a dark, a negative, and a positive side to telling stories, because politicians can manipulate us by telling us stories that are not factual. We can just look at what's happening in the world at the moment with I don't want to go down the political road on this, but the vaxxers again, and the non-vaxxers, or the anti-vaxxers, and the sort of stories that are being told around by the anti-vaxxers in particular. But so I think it has that power to connect with us on an emotional level, and by doing that, we're more likely to change our beliefs and therefore our behavior.
Yeah, because stories have, throughout the ages, stories have been told to persuade as well.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah. They serve, many purposes, and one of the purposes, is like we learn through stories. So stories are told so that our children will learn. What is useful, what is wise, and make distinctions between what is good and what is bad, what is considered to be functional and dysfunctional. And the stories, I suppose what you've said is like really important. We have to know which stories that we want to buy into and which stories we don't want to buy into.
Yes. Yeah. I interesting you saying that about as children as well, because I was thinking about the sort of stories we were told as children and the stereotypes that sometimes that created, thinking about Sleeping Beauty, or the stories where there was always a beautiful princess and then the prince would come along and rescue her, and that kind of whole stereotypical world was created, that girls grew up thinking they had to have long blonde hair and be beautiful, and they still do, and that one day this handsome prince will ride up on a horse and rescue them. But I mean that sort of stereotype. And then I like the stories about like The Hare and the Tortoise, that are great stories about, trying to tell us something that very philosophical almost, that you don't have to, the person who rushes in fastest doesn't always win the game, whatever that is, whatever that game might be. So I think the power of those stories that we heard as children are quite strong. And sometimes we don't, as a mother, I'm not, I think I was really happy when I found The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as a story, because that whole story around the lion and how the lion could have feelings and be gentle and was just so powerful for me as a story to sort of tell to my daughter.
Yeah, that's right. Those fairy stories that we grew up on, they do, I suppose, in our unconscious, they remain in our unconscious and they influence us unconsciously. And I suppose that's one of the reasons that these stories are being retold in a different way. I think one of them, Maleficent, it's with have you heard of this new film? It's not so new, I've just watched it recently, Maleficent. And it's reshaping that story of the wicked fairy godmother. Like there were 3 fairy godmothers and one of them wasn't invited, and she cast a spell that the child would, I think it must be Sleeping Beauty, that child would fall asleep at the age of 16 and only be woken up by the kiss of a prince. And in this reshaping of that story, Maleficent, we find out that her wings were clipped by this princess's father, you know, the king, her wings
Yeah,
have been
yeah.
clipped. And so there's something metaphorical about that. It's like, so this
Yeah.
woman was an abused woman, you know, her freedom had been taken away. And so you know, the metaphor of that, of like, you see her kind of endeavors to regain her freedom in a very different light when you know that one fact. It's like, well, who clipped her wings? It was the king that clipped her wings. So how should she behave?
Yes, yeah. And that's a lovely way of also looking at how we can walk around a story and see it from different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also something that's so important, that we don't just see it through one perspective. We have to look at the other perspectives that are going on. Yeah.
Right. And then also you talk about imagery, and the imagery that we associated with these stories. So like these little princesses, like Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, they were blue-eyed and blonde-haired in the fairy books that fairy stories that I read. And so the impression of what is beautiful, you know, and I think that shapes our behavior. It's like, what is beautiful and what is ugly, you know, like, and so those, I think, you know, our inner biases, sometimes people say, oh, there are racial biases, and I think it's much deeper than racial biases. I think it's aesthetic biases.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, that regardless of what race somebody is, if they are beautiful in the sense of like how we have been conditioned to believe, like, well, that is beauty, they will do well. Whereas regardless of what race somebody is, if they look ugly based on, you know, these initial deep impressions that we've got of like who is ugly, then they probably won't do so well. And I think there has been research to show that attractiveness associated with a high level of success. So what is it that considered to be attractive?
Absolutely. I mean, this whole thing was when even back to when I was working in personnel management, or HR as it became known, there was that whole debate about whether people should put their pictures on their CVs. It's interesting, in France, it's normal. You put your picture on your CV. And there's been a whole load of research here by, you know, people making assumptions then about you. And also when they tried to make them anonymous, even people interpreting their names. So that's not a, you know, that's a name that clearly implies this person comes from a different culture. And I think that whole, you know, potential to influence, to kind of already to create a story around the person before you've even got to know them, before you've even heard them utter one word. I find that quite abysmal in say recruiting, well, in any field, but certainly in that recruitment field. And it's been a big issue for a long time, that the whole thing about what is attractive, and and the way youngsters and teenagers are teenage girls in particular in the West are trying to live up to that. But you know, I can't imagine how it must feel for teenagers in different cultures who are coming into the West and facing that.
That's right, you know, and I suppose plastic surgery is a booming business, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
it's sad. I know it's necessary for injuries, and I'm all for that if somebody needs to redo something that's been damaged, but
no, it's like reshaping face, not only the faces, the whole body, reshape in order to match what is considered to be aesthetically beautiful. And so that is a story in itself, isn't it? You know,
it is
a story of beauty. And I think, definitely, I think the story of like beauty it's much more, or the dysfunctions around it are much more harmful than the race issue. You know, we know there are racial biases, but there are also biases that, you know, if somebody's if somebody's tall, are they necessarily going to be a better manager because they're tall? But you know, when you look around and you see managers, they're hardly ever short.
So this is so I'm here as a small woman, so you can imagine the prejudices I've had in the years that I was in the private sector in the UK. But yes, as a small woman. Yeah, my dad was a very small man, and he used to reckon, I mean, I think it tended to make him a little bit more aggressive to overcome that, but he did reckon he was often overlooked when he went into a meeting. He had something important to convey, which is terrible. Yeah. Again, it's stereotypes.
In a way, the Zoom meetings or the online platform, for me, it's like a great equalizer, because
Yes.
no one knows how tall or how short you are, and no one knows, you know, it's not like your voice is kind of equalized, I suppose, isn't it? You know, I suppose it depends on the quality of your microphone.
That's an interesting point, interesting discussion, that. Yes.
In terms of what is mysterious then about, you know, the association between creativity and stories, then what do you think, you know, because we know a lot about behaviorism, we know that there are links between identity, values and behavior. That is kind of like, that field has been well researched. What do you think is still mysterious about this relationship between stories, creativity and culture?
I think probably the big thing is the unconscious, because although there's a lot of work going on in the neurological field, I don't think we've quite understand, you know, what happens when that. So when you're told a story, or when you start to visualize a story and you start to try and create that, and then, you know, you let it go for a while, ideas come into your head. You start to think, you know, I mean, some of my best ideas come to me in the morning when I'm taking my shower. You know, what's that about? I don't know. It's sitting there. It's sitting on my unconscious. Something is working away on it, my brain, and then something will pop up completely. It might be a connection to the past, or it might be a connecting of two different ideas, and definitely an aha moment. I think that, for me, that's fascinating. Now, there probably is quite a lot of work going on in that, and I've kind of touched on some of the latest neural, you know, thinking about the brain. But I think that, to me, is one of the, you know, it's, so we can, you know, I've worked with groups who have made that breakthrough in terms of creative thinking. And sometimes it takes a while for them to get there, but they need to let go, and you know, we can work on different techniques using visualization, imagery. It's still very difficult to put your finger on what actually happened. It's you can't see any, it's not like logical, you know, reasoning where you can see the logical progression of, you know, the mathematical equation, if you like. You can't see any of that. So it's what is it that actually help them see that thing differently, and that's to me the magical thing that is unexplainable to me.
Yes, it reminds me of the Greek, when the Greeks used to say that creativity is already exists, and I more recently that nothing new is, you know, we can't invent it, we can only simply uncover it. And maybe a few months ago, I heard someone from India saying, we don't create thoughts, we receive them. You know, thoughts are received, and so that's kind of a very different way of looking at creativity, is that it comes through us, and we don't invent it. We don't invent creativity. We allow it to come through us.
Yeah, I think that's it. We allow it to happen. And I mean, there's this whole thing about, you know, synchronicity, that often the same ideas, the same thoughts, the same sort of stories are starting to emerge in different parts of the world, without necessarily anybody sharing those. So it's like, how is that happening? That synchronicity, the connections that suddenly pop up, you know, I think there is something very almost otherworldly going on there that I can't explain. But I think that's why one of the premises in creativity is just to be open to what may come, to what may happen, and to be totally non-judgmental and almost accepting.
Yeah.
It's almost like you put it out to the universe and then you see what comes back. And that, it gets a little bit, mystical. But I find that fascinating.
So I suppose as a creative, as someone who is so passionate about creativity, I suppose in terms of your own identity, there are times when I think of myself as an artist. There have been times, and I don't think of myself as an artist now. I think of myself as a writer rather than an artist. And that shift in identity makes me behave in a different way. So for yourself, what is your identity? How do you allow that creativity to come through you? How do you identify in the realm of creativity?
That's quite interesting, because I'm actually shifting a little bit now. I'm doing less work on helping people to be more creative, and more on allowing my creativity to happen. So I'm also doing more writing and photography. And I think for me, it comes through when I just go out with my camera and get lost. Lost in a sort of in the flow. As Csikszentmihalyi talks about being in the flow. And I think if you can get into that flow in whatever you're doing, then the creativity happens. And you start to see things differently. You start to see things you didn't see before. And it's the same in a way with, I like writing short stories, because somehow they're more in my head, they become more creative when I'm writing a short story, or rather, the creativity comes out more when I'm writing a short story. And again, if I can get into the flow of writing something like that, and almost sometimes just starting from scratch and just doing free writing and then seeing what happens, I think the creativity can come out then. So I don't know that I would say I identify with creativity in that way, but I think that's what I'm allowing. That's the spaces in which I'm allowing almost the creativity to come in and happen.
And when Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talks about being in the flow, very often we're in the flow when we're engaged in doing something, or doing something that we love. We're just so engrossed in it. We love that, and I suppose that's the emotion associated with creativity. It's like when it's something that comes from the love and the passion, then there's energy in it.
Yes, absolutely. And whatever it is, I mean, I kind of, if there's one thing I'd urge everyone to do, it would be to find something that you can lose yourself in the flow of doing, that is creating, and just trying it, whether it's painting, writing, singing, making music,
gardening,
sculpture, gardening. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which we can lose ourselves to that. If you can go and do something for a couple of hours and forget, if I can do it and forget that I haven't had my coffee, then I know I'm in the flow. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I've really loved.
Thank you, Jesvi. I've enjoyed our conversation this morning, and I wish you all the best with the conference, and look forward to tuning into it.
Okay, brilliant, Barbara. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.